All right, hi all. We're the team from Tulane, and for the past 6 weeks, we've been working on modeling the interaction between giraffes in the savannah and the acacia trees that they browse on. So, just to start off with a little background.
So the acacia trees and the giraffes, which they are each other's main predator and prey, and they have coexisted for over 2 million years, and so have since become evolutionarily codependent and have developed these sort of famous traits that we associate with each species, like the giraffe's long neck, the acacia tree's height, and the big thorns that the acacia trees have to kind of prevent them from being browsed on. But our model focuses on these other interactions that they have developed, which is the tree's production of tannin on its leaves, which is a toxic chemical to the giraffe's digestive system, and additionally, the tree's production of this ethylene gas that they use to signal to other nearby trees to also begin producing that tannin.
So, as Annika just said, when a tree is eaten or browsed by a giraffe, it will begin producing the ethylene gas along with the tannin. The gas will then travel with the wind to nearby trees. Once the trees intercept this ethylene signal, they will also begin producing tannin. They may also produce ethylene gas, but this idea of a cascading signal is not proven to happen or to not happen. There's just not enough data on it. Therefore, our model takes into account these two scenarios as shown in this diagram.
And the giraffes kind of have two things that determine their reasoning, two strategies that determine their predation strategy. Um, First of all, they generally always browse the trees upwind as opposed to downwind because they are evolutionarily aware of the ethylene tannin strategies that the trees employ. So they kind of the way I think about it is they kind of flank the trees from behind, sort of thing. Um, and another thing they do is it's kind of just like the limits of their eyesight. They will browse. They will find trees within 90 meters of their current position. And these are two things that we both incorporate into our model.
All right, so now we're going to get a little bit more into the technical side of our model just for a little bit.
So we obviously used NetLogo like everybody else to create an agent-based system with trees and giraffes as our two main turtles. And so most of the time we had a fixed quantity of each agent at the start, but we did run a couple experiments where we varied the quantities of trees and giraffes, which we'll get into. And then each tile of the world has a tannin concentration attribute, so that where the trees are placed, they can that is taken into consideration. And then all of our other parameters you can see in the screenshot on the side can be user adjusted using these sliders. And so some of them we varied to take into to analyze what would happen with varied wind strength, for example, or signaling threshold, which is the amount of ethylene a tree needed to receive in order to start producing tannin. And then other things we always kept fixed. For example, you can see the sliders that are vertical are all of the times that it takes for a tree to become poisonous, which we will go over in a couple of slides. And then in terms of outputs, we had the GUI with all of our agents on it. And then we also had a couple of monitor graphs that you can see on the side. So we had a browsing count and then also the trees signaled to versus the trees browsed and how each tree started producing tannin.
All right, so the first big part of our model, obviously, we needed a wind system to carry the signal from one tree to another. And this one is not built using vectors, which is how gas diffusion is normally done. This is built on linear algebra concepts because this is an agent-based model. So each tile of the world has an attribute from 0 to 100, and that's the concentration of gas in that tile. So 100 is all the way saturated, and 0 is there's no gas there. And the system can incorporate a wind speed input, obviously how strong the wind is. There's a diffusion coefficient, which is like how strong each tile conveys gas to the next one, how quickly it diffuses. There's a dispersion coefficient, because our model is really 2D, we can't account for gas kind of flying up into the atmosphere and dispersing. Obviously, some will leave the system. So there's a coefficient that'll take a fixed amount off the top of every tile each tick. And there is a world boundary to the diffusion. It's a concept we ripped from thermodynamics. Um, Gas can exit the sides of our world, but it can't enter back in, and that's to keep our system from kind of getting stuck in a loop. So the concentration of each tile is represented by a color, as you can see on the right. So white is 100 and black is 0, and then anything between 0 and 100 are various shades of red.
So with the giraffes, we have them as yellow turtles in the model. Their behavior is pretty oversimplified to make their browsing non-poisonous trees their primary motivation. They'll seek with a speed defined at setup the healthy tree nearest to them within their search radius. So those are really two main parameters besides the initial number of giraffes that are spawned. When a healthy tree is not within their search radius, they orient themselves in a random direction and move at a speed until an available healthy tree is hopefully within that radius. Since our scale is on the smaller side, with the model simulating over a shorter period of time over a small stretch of savanna, the giraffes do not reproduce or gain any sort of energy from eating the trees. The only result of the giraffe behavior is making the trees produce tannin for the rest of the simulation. The giraffes themselves do not gain anything. And as mentioned before, our model utilizes both giraffe browsing and this chemical cascade to determine the tannin production in the trees. The browse trees start by being healthy, as shown in green, and are given the interim state of being eaten, which is shown in white as the browse tree, to account for the time delay it takes for ethylene to start being produced. A time delay also accounts for the change in state for it to become producing tannin and to reach the threshold for it to become poisonous. Lastly, the tree is expected to stop producing ethylene at some point in time and to only produce tannin. But if it again receives an ethylene signal, it will revert back to the previous state, as shown from the dark blue tree going back to the lighter blue tree. Our model assumes that once a tree begins producing tannin, it will keep producing tannin as the model's timescale is in terms of hours, and acacia trees contain enough tannin to be poisonous for multiple days at a time in real life after they're initially browsed.
Sorry. This is just the culmination of both of these systems. Obviously, so we have the giraffe behavior and the gas decision, the gas diffusion working in tandem now. And if you're curious, the 3D model or the 3D simulation we have built here is not what we use for testing because it lacks the topological consistency that we like, or the fact that the world wraps around. It's not particularly accurate, like a Pac-Man sort of thing. So this is just for demonstration purposes, and it looks very nice, and you can see the systems working together.
All right, moving on. So here are the big conclusions that we reached during our project. The first one that we noticed was with the giraffe behavior, specifically as we varied the search radius and the speed. So the search radius is how far a giraffe can see to go find out a tree, and the speed is how many tiles they walk per tick. So this chart here shows iterating both of those things. The bigger columns are the search radius. From left to right, it increases, and within those columns, the different colored bands are the giraffe speed varying from 0.1 tiles per tick up to 0.5. And what you can see, obviously, as the speed increases, obviously the giraffes can browse more trees, and this is out of 41 trees. So they tend to get most of them. And there's a little bit of noise. It changes a little bit. It's not always perfectly always increasing just in the way it's randomly generated. But it does tend to increase. But over time, the search radius increases. The number of trees browsed doesn't really increase. Mostly, we think because it's the time limits that we have on how long our model runs. Even if a giraffe sees a tree, it still takes just as long to get to it. 0.1 ticks, or excuse me, 0.1 tiles is still 0.1 tiles per tick. So it doesn't really mean that they can go faster. It just means that they can see more. So there's a slight upward trend, but not nearly as great as we have hypothesized at the beginning.
So here's a chart of those parameters, search radius and speed, fixed at with a speed of 0.3 tiles per tick and an 18 tile search radius. They will find and eat the healthy trees at a smooth rate until all of them will become poisonous. At around 250 ticks, you can see that it kind of plateaus. In real life, once all the trees are signaling and or producing tannin, the giraffes would migrate to another patch of land. But here they really move around randomly once all of the trees are poisonous. As Hayden said, there's just not enough time to go see those other trees that would be available. With an average total of 35.5 trees browsed here, the trees have eaten an average of 8.9 trees per giraffe. In this simulation with the aforementioned fixed parameters, we measured the average distance each giraffe traveled between each tree browsed. In this case, the giraffes each traveled an average of 2.81 tiles per tree browsed by the end of the simulation, as the available healthy trees, on average, would be farther away as they browse the ones closest to them first. So this way you see an upward trend with distance. This formula was found as the total browsing count, as shown in the top right graph, divided by the number of giraffes and multiplied by the giraffe speed. As shown from the bottom right graph, the average distance will plateau as all of the trees become poisonous. The giraffes are then moving randomly in search of a healthy tree that is no longer there.
All right, so in our studies of the gas signaling system, we found some really interesting conclusions, particularly that there's somewhat pretty clear boundaries to how effective the signaling is across wind speed and distance. The two graphs on the right, really, they're the same data. It was measuring the effective distance as we iterate both through the signaling threshold, so how much gas is needed to trigger the system, and the wind strength carrying the gas. And what we found, if you'll notice in the bottom right graph, that the presence of any gas, that's that top line, so that's when the threshold is 0, doesn't change at all with wind speed, and it's effective only to about 22 tiles. So there is an inherent ceiling. It can never be farther than 22, but as long as the threshold is greater than 0, so 10, 20, and so on percent, it increases to a point to about 1.4 tiles per tick with wind speed, and then it plateaus. And it doesn't matter how much the wind increases, it won't go any farther because the wind blows the gas around, and it's impossible for it to actually really diffuse and amass any sort of concentration. And you can see up in the top right graph that there is there's a ceiling to how effective the system is with the signaling percentage, this sensitivity of the system. So anything greater than really 27% or so, it doesn't travel any distance at all because there's simply not enough gas diffusing out to reach that sort of concentration. So yeah, that was really interesting and not at all what we thought would come out. We thought it would be a lot more complex and a lot more nuanced and not have such clear defined boundaries. And you can see this in the giraffe behavior as well. This graph is measuring the number of trees signaled and the number of trees browsed on average across an entire iteration. And the bottom axis here is the signaling threshold in percent, and that lines up with the data we did just looking at the gas, that anything past a 15% sensitivity, really the signaling system isn't working. The only changes that are happening are the trees being browsed by the giraffes, and nothing's really happening with the signaling system. It's only effective when it's sensitive less than 15% per tile.
And these are two separate. Well, this is an experiment that dealt with setting everything constant, but manipulating the initial giraffe spawnage, so like where they start in relative to the map. So we had 3 experiments. One where they were dispersed randomly around the map. One where they were spawned upwind, and one where they were spawned downwind. As you can see, the giraffes have a extreme benefit when going upwind, because if you see, the amount of trees browsed is the greatest when it is upwind, and it's significantly decreased when it's downwind. Randomly, as expected, is between the two. And you can see, like, it really extremely on the left, when the giraffes are spawned upwind, almost no trees get signaled at all. Like, maybe one or two trees, tops, get signaled. The giraffes just flank them from behind, basically, and eat them before they can warn the other trees in advance that the giraffes are coming to eat all of them. And obviously, when the giraffes are spawned downwind is when they have the most trouble. The most trees are signaled. And this is some things that are kind of obvious, but it's good to have intuition confirmed. Obviously, the amount of trees browsed increases with the amount of giraffes there are on the map. So it kind of, at 10 giraffes, it kind of caps out at about 90%. Would be interesting to see necessarily if we had an overwhelming amount of giraffes, if it would be possible to get that close to 1, but I'm not sure if it kind of just, it's impossible or not. And then the browsing count per giraffe, also as expected, the amount of trees that each giraffe consumes decays sort of as you add more giraffes, with about 2 per giraffe at 10.
So we did run into a couple of challenges, major challenges while we were creating this model, which we've chronicled over the past weeks in our weekly presentations for you guys, but we just wanted to go back over everything that we ran into. First of which was just our computational limits. We had to be mindful of the scale of both the map and the wind, thinking about what our computers in NetLogo could handle in building that. Obviously, we couldn't make like a days-long giant world simulation because it just wouldn't be realistic in terms of what we could handle. And then also the gas mechanics. We're limited by what NetLogo could do. In one of the gas presentations, Hayden asked a question about gas, and he was like, "Yeah, no, that sounds really hard." And so we had to figure out how to work that into NetLogo. And you can see here, this image is from before we kind of refined the gas diffusion mechanism, and it would just blow up a lot of the time. And then we also had to keep in mind parameter limits. There was a lot of data that we just couldn't really find in a lot of the biological papers we read, especially on this biochemical signaling. We had to just make decisions for a lot of the parameters in terms of what made sense and what would work. And then also just to keep it within the scale of what we wanted to do. Like, we decided for the sake of complexity to make our model just over the time of 1 day, so we didn't have to account for that reproduction or energy or trees regaining their ability to be eaten. And then also like I said before, with the gas diffusion, there was just a lot of numerical instability that we had to account for to keep it running.
So the main takeaways that we got from this, well, one of the most interesting things is that the system is actually not very chaotic. In fact, so changing the initial parameters a little bit does not drastically change the outcome. It's fairly deterministic. Basically, in all cases, that the giraffes consume all the trees, or an overwhelming amount of the trees, and the remaining trees are just poisonous and are inaccessible. And another thing is that giraffes, as seen with the bar graphs from earlier, they are obviously the most effective going upwind, which is, confirming their evolutionary response that they have evolved over millions of years. We've confirmed that is, in fact, correct and a good strategy with our simulation. And also something interesting is that the signaling has very defined boundaries. Surprisingly, Hayden had a graph earlier that was basically just saying like, okay, this is where the threshold works, and then it suddenly just stops. So we know we know what factors make signaling work and what makes it not work. And also, standardly, the browsing rate fits kind of standard logarithmic, where you have a very rapid growth initially, followed by a plateau because of carrying capacity, which is what we expected. And also, signaling occurs very rapidly, almost exponentially, as expected as well.
And also with our project, there's a lot of potential future research that could be done. This really could be the start of a much larger project. The first thing that could obviously be expanded upon is the tree reproduction and the giraffe reproduction. We didn't implement that because the time scale that we were looking at was just simply too small. We were looking at about the time span of a day, but we didn't have the time in weeks to work on this or the time to run the simulations to handle giraffe and tree reproduction, which happens on this span of weeks or the span of years. But that's typically more classic population ecology, which would be really interesting to study on a longer window. And at that point, you could also get into having the giraffes evolve and implementing even something like machine learning to have the giraffes evolve this behavior and see if we could replicate them learning to go upwind just like they do in the wild. We also could significantly improve our gas mechanics. It's still really quantized onto those tiles. So if we make the tiles smaller, it would be more realistic. It'd be more computationally intense, but we would also eliminate a lot of that noise that we have statistically. And as well, like David touched on earlier, the system was surprisingly really clean. And we were wondering the entire time if it was possible that the system could be deterministic analytically, that if you set the parameters a certain way ahead of time, could you call how it was going to end at a certain number of ticks without running the simulation? That was something we were interested in, but we were just limited by the time scale of this project. And if you guys find this PowerPoint online, the button on the left leads to our source code, so you can actually pull up our model and mess with it yourself. And on the right is all of our raw experimental data. If you have any questions on this, just shoot us an email at the address there below. We do want to thank our advisors, Matt and Michael, for their tremendous amount of help. Matt particularly was really helping us out. We were very new to this because we're all math people. We didn't have any biology work, so he was great. And obviously the SCMB for introducing us this concept and giving us the resources and the cool lectures these past few weeks.
Thanks so much, folks. Any questions for Team Tulane? We're running a little behind, so I would maybe say we have time for one question for Team Tulane.
I know it's not a short question, but I'll maybe ask what most, if they could say what most surprised them that they learned through the experience.
Of course, we had a big thing that surprised us. We didn't include it because there was no way to, I guess, prove it empirically. But the giraffes, it was this weird emergent behavior. We didn't code the giraffes to be aware really of the wind. Especially in our larger scale studies, they would figure out which way the wind was and go upwind anyways. Even with random wandering patterns, they would always follow the wind and move upwind, even though on paper they had no way to tell. So we didn't include that because we hadn't, I guess, proved its existence rigorously enough, but it was definitely really surprising.
For me, I was really surprised at how, I think, difficult it is to really nail down the scale of any simulation, because you try to make it reflect the real world almost exactly, but it's too abstract, and you end up having to just do everything kind of proportionally. And I think we ended up doing a pretty good job of that, but also our scale could only be in terms of a couple of hours. It would be a whole nother program, essentially, or model to do it in terms of like days or even years.